Hey there, dreamers. Welcome back to our channel. Before we drift into the classic journey of Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz from Phineas and Ferb, I'd love to know where in the world are you watching from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always fascinating seeing how far and wide our sleepy little community reaches. All right, without further ado, lights low, blankets up, let's begin. The evening sky above the tri-state area faded into a deep, velvety blue, the last hints of sunset slowly dissolving into the horizon. High above the quieting city, a crooked tower leaned awkwardly but proudly against the skyline. Its lights glimmered faintly, as though uncertain whether to stay awake or give in to the night. This was, of course, the home and laboratory of Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz, a place of peculiar angles, questionable structural safety, and at this hour, an unusual hush. Inside, the Lair felt softer than it usually did. The familiar buzz of machines was gone, replaced with the gentle hum of an old desk lamp. Its circle of warm light rested over cluttered blueprints, loose screws, and abandoned tools. On one of the work tables sat a peculiar half-finished contraption with the words, "The I Really Need Sleep-inator," scribbled in bold marker across the side. Wires hung loosely, a lever stuck awkwardly in mid-turn, as if the invention itself had grown tired and given up for the evening. Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz sat slouched in his swiveling chair, his tall frame curved into an unusual posture of relaxation. His lab coat, usually pristine in its cartoonishly exaggerated way, had become a little wrinkled and bunched, while his boots were set aside, replaced by a pair of floppy slippers. It wasn't often that Heinz allowed himself this kind of comfort. Normally he was bouncing from one half-baked scheme to the next, filled with endless energy for his over-the-top monologues. Tonight, though, his energy had drained into something gentler. He looked less like a so-called evil scientist, and more like a man at the end of a very long day. Heinz let out a quiet sigh and tilted his chair back until his gaze rested on the ceiling. A single glow-in-the-dark star sticker, left over from some forgotten project, clung to the plaster like a small, defiant reminder of childhood. He squinted at it, then smiled faintly. "Ah," he said aloud, his voice surprisingly soft. "Finally, some peace and quiet, no explosions, no Perry the Platypus barging in. Though, to be fair, he might still barge in. He usually does. But until then, it is peaceful." The sound of his own words floated gently in the air, then dissolved into the silence. There was no sarcastic retort, no interruption. Just the soft hum of electricity through the walls and the faint chirping of crickets outside the cracked open window. Heinz shifted in his chair, drawing the warmth of the desk lamp closer like it was a miniature sun. The shadows stretched long across the Lair, not harsh but comfortable, like a cozy blanket laid across the room. Even the refrigerator, tucked into one corner of the lab, contributed to the nighttime symphony with its steady low hum. For a man so used to chaos, the calm was nearly overwhelming. He sipped from a chipped mug that rested on the desk. Steam drifted up in lazy spirals from the chamomile tea inside, carrying with it the faint scent of honey. The mug itself was decorated with a cartoon platypus, an odd clearance purchase Heinz had made years ago, but had since grown oddly fond of. He smiled faintly at the irony of drinking tea out of a Perry-themed cup. "Not bad," he muttered, swirling the mug softly. "A little too much honey, maybe, but, hey, I deserve honey. It's been a long day of semi-evil, which is still tiring. Mischief is exhausting, you know. Nobody talks about that." The tea warmed his hands as he carried it over to the wide glass window overlooking the tri-state area. From this height, the city looked smaller, almost fragile. Cars moved like glowing beetles across the darkened streets. Street lamps cast little halos of amber light that blurred slightly in the distance. A lone dog barked, its sound drifting up faintly. Everything below moved at its own unbothered rhythm, and for once, Heinz felt no urge to interrupt it with an invention. He leaned his elbows on the sill and watched quietly, his lanky silhouette framed by the night. The breeze that slipped in through the window was cool and smelled faintly of rain. He let it wash over him, blinking slowly as though even his eyes were growing tired. "Not bad," he whispered to himself again. "Not bad at all." And so in the quiet of the lair, with slippers on his feet, a llama print blanket draped loosely over his shoulders, and tea warming his hands, Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz allowed himself the rarest invention of all, stillness. The mug grew lighter in his hands as he took slow, thoughtful sips. Each swallow of the chamomile tea seemed to press gently against the edges of his restless energy, softening the corners, easing the sharpness of his usual chatter. By the time the cup was nearly empty, Heinz found himself humming, softly, tunelessly, something that might have once been a lullaby, though it was now muddled by years and a thick accent. He placed the mug back on the sill, letting the last curls of steam drift away into the night air. The city lights blinked steadily below, patient and calm. It almost looked like the tri-state area was sleeping too. Heinz tilted his head and chuckled quietly at the thought. If only the whole city could just take a nap. Everyone lying down at the same time. Imagine that. No noise, no yelling, no traffic jams. Just quiet. For once, Heinz Doofenshmirtz would not need an inventor for peace, because peace would already be here. He sat with that thought longer than he expected. Normally, he would have spun the idea into an invention, perhaps a city-wide synchronized nap-inator, but instead he let it rest as an amusing daydream. The stillness of the moment didn't invite scheming. It only invited breathing. Behind him, the lair had shifted into something that felt almost domestic. The clutter on the tables no longer looked like the remains of chaotic experiments, but rather like the familiar scatter of someone's lived-in space. The crooked shelves held not only gadgets and blueprints, but also a few framed photos slightly tilted. One of Vanessa as a small child, one of him at some kind of obscure evil science award show, and curiously, a stock photo of a kitten he'd never gotten around to replacing. The photos were usually background noise to his frantic life, but tonight, in the golden lamplight, they looked warm, personal, anchoring. Heinz turned away from the window and shuffled back to his desk chair, pulling the llama blanket up properly around his shoulders. It smelled faintly of laundry detergent, the simple kind that reminded him of being younger, back before evil science had seemed like the only path. He rubbed the edge of the blanket between his fingers and sighed, sinking into the cushion with a satisfied creak. The tick-tock of a small wall clock filled the silence. Its rhythm was steady and patient, a reminder that time could move slowly if one let it. Heinz tilted his head toward the sound, matching his breathing to its rhythm. Inhale with one tick, exhale with the next. The exercise, unintentional at first, became something soothing. His shoulders sank further. His eyelids fluttered, heavy but not yet closing. He considered in the quiet the strange luxury of doing nothing. Usually he filled silence with long-winded stories of his tragic backstory or arguments with his own inventions. But now, with no one to impress and nothing to conquer, he let silence simply be silence. It was, surprisingly, enough. He thought briefly of Perry the Platypus, his nemesis, his audience, his unspoken friend. The absence of the platypus tonight felt strange at first, but then, as Heinz adjusted the blanket again, he found the emptiness oddly restful. Maybe, he muttered drowsily, maybe Perry is also at home, in a blanket, sipping tea. Maybe he also hums lullabies to himself. Maybe he has a mug with my face on it. That would be nice. The thought drew a chuckle from his throat, a soft, contented sound. He let the idea linger as he leaned back further into the chair, his head tilted against the cushion, his eyes half closed, the glow from the lamp painting his features in amber tones. The Lair felt less like the headquarters of an eccentric scientist and more like an odd but cozy living room. The whir of the fridge joined the clock's ticking. The night air drifted lazily through the curtains, and somewhere outside a nightbird called once before settling. It was not silence, but it was peace, the kind that fills the air like a slow exhale. "Tomorrow," he whispered softly. "The inventions can wait. Tonight is just for resting." And with that small declaration, the room seemed to settle further, as though the walls themselves approved of the decision. The hands of the clock crept forward, each second clicking into place like a gentle tap on the shoulder. Doofenshmirtz noticed it only vaguely, as if the sound had become part of his breathing. He sat cocooned in his chair, llama blanket pulled snugly around him, slippers tapping softly as he rocked his feet. There was something childlike about the rhythm, as though he had rediscovered the comfort of rocking gently before sleep. His gaze drifted to the cluttered workbench. Half-finished gadgets sat abandoned, each labeled in his hurried handwriting. There was the left-shoe-only-inator, the remote control that controls other remotes-inator, and of course, the sleep-inator, which looked more like a pile of wires with ambition than a functional invention. Normally, seeing his projects unfinished would have filled him with dramatic frustration, the kind that usually led to rants about his childhood. But tonight they looked harmless, innocent even, and like toys forgotten at bedtime. He chuckled softly to himself. "Ah, Sleep-inator, you are not ready, but then again, neither am I." His voice dropped to a whisper, almost swallowed by the still air. "Maybe tonight. I just let sleep find me instead." His chair squeaked as he turned slightly, letting his gaze wander across the shelves again. A small, crooked plant leaned toward the lamplight, its leaves drooping from neglect. Heinz squinted at it, frowning gently. "I should water you tomorrow," he muttered. Yes, a new project. Keep the plant alive. Much simpler than taking over the tri-state area. Less paperwork, too." The thought amused him, and he gave a tired laugh, shaking his head. The air grew heavier as the night deepened. Outside the window, fewer cars passed on the streets. Porch lights clicked off one by one until only the moonlight and scattered fireflies kept the dark company. From up high in his lair, Heinz felt suspended from it all, like a quiet observer looking down at a city tucked under its own blanket. He tilted his head back, closing his eyes for a moment. Images from earlier in the day flickered across his mind. Blue sparks from an invention short-circuiting, Perry's familiar chattering glare, the faint smell of smoke after an explosion. But instead of spiraling into frustration, the memories softened into faint echoes, like drawings fading on old paper. He could almost laugh at them now. It wasn't so bad, he admitted to himself, his voice thick with drowsiness. Today could have been worse. At least no giant rubber band ball rolled over the Lair. That's progress. Another creak from the chair accompanied his shifting weight as he snuggled deeper under the blanket. He rubbed his hands together for warmth, then let them rest against his stomach, rising and falling with each slow breath. For a man so often wound tight with plans and problems, the surrender to stillness felt new, strange but good. He noticed the lamp flicker once as if debating whether to stay on. The golden light tremble, casting the shadows into a soft dance across the walls. Heinz whispered to it like one might to a pet. "Stay with me a little longer, lamp. Tomorrow you can rest. Tonight, we enjoy the glow together." And so the little lamp held on, its beam steadying again. The room was bathed once more in amber warmth, wrapping every odd invention, crooked shelf, and weary scientist in a shared hush. Doofenshmirtz exhaled through his nose, the sound long and low, like the release of tension that had sat in his chest for years. He let his mind drift without direction, allowing small fragments of thought to rise and fall. He wondered briefly if Vanessa was at home already asleep, her headphones buzzing faint music as she dreamed. He wondered if Perry was curled up somewhere in a tiny bed, perhaps even snoring. He wondered if anyone in the tri-state area at this very moment thought kindly of him. The thoughts weren't bitter tonight. They didn't sting. They simply passed through, like clouds across the moon. Heinz didn't try to hold them or push them away. He just let them come and go, carried on the quiet rhythm of night. He murmured, half smiling. This is not so bad. I could get used to this." His eyelids drooped lower, his chin resting against the collar of his lab coat. The warmth of the blanket, the steady hum of the fridge, the golden glow of the lamp, it all conspired gently to coax him further toward rest. The hour grew late, though time inside the lair seemed to move differently. The clock still ticked in its patient rhythm, but Heinz barely noticed it now. His thoughts had slowed into long, gentle stretches like ripples, spreading out on still water. The frantic bursts of energy that normally defined his evenings had given way to something rare and unfamiliar, calm contentment. He reached over to the desk and picked up the mug again, forgetting it was empty. The cool porcelain pressed lightly against his fingers, and he smiled at the simple comfort of holding it. "You did your job, T," he whispered, setting it back down with care. His voice was nearly swallowed by the hush of the room, but the act of speaking reassured him, like he wasn't entirely alone. The llama blanket slipped slightly from his shoulder, and he tugged it back up, cocooning himself tightly. The fabric brushed his cheek, soft and warm, carrying the faint smell of lavender detergent. He sank deeper into the chair, letting its squeak accompany his shifting weight like a lullaby. His long legs stretched out, slippers dangling lazily at the ends of his feet, one nearly slipping off. For a moment he simply listened. The hum of the fridge, the faint rattle of the window as the breeze moved it. Somewhere below, a car door shut, then silence again. These weren't the sounds of danger or invention. They were the sounds of a world at rest, and they seeped into him like gentle reminders that he too could rest. His gaze drifted back to the ceiling. That stubborn glow-in-the-dark star still clung there, flickering faintly against the dark. Heinz squinted at it, then gave a sleepy grin. "Still hanging on, huh? Good for you. If a tiny sticker can survive on the ceiling all these years, maybe I can make it through another day too. You are motivational, little star. Motivational. And sticky." The words dissolved into a chuckle, though his voice was already thick with drowsiness. He let his head rest against the back of the chair, feeling the gentle pull of gravity coax him lower. His eyelids fluttered, heavy, half-closing until the lamplight blurred into a soft halo. He thought of tomorrow briefly. The unfinished gadgets, the lonely plant waiting for water, the possibility of Perry showing up at an inconvenient hour. Normally those thoughts would have ignited restless energy, but tonight they folded neatly into the background, postponed without guilt. The future could wait. The night asked only for rest. Tomorrow. "I'll fix everything tomorrow," he mumbled, though even he didn't seem convinced. His voice had dropped to a low murmur, the edges of words slurring slightly. The lamp cast its steady glow over him, reflecting in the gentle lines of his face. For once, those lines did not deepen with worry or exaggeration. They softened, smoothed by the quiet acceptance of the moment. The scientist who so often thrashed against the world now looked at last like any tired soul finding comfort in the end of a long day. He shifted one last time, tucking the blanket tighter around himself, letting his head fall slightly to the side. His breathing steadied, long and even, syncing once again with the tick-tock of the clock. In that rhythm, he found a peace he rarely allowed himself to feel. The Lair joined him in this stillness. The shelves sat patiently. The inventions slept in their unfinished state. Even the refrigerator's hum seemed gentler, as though lowering its tone to lull its owner into slumber. The entire space, which so often throbbed with chaotic energy, had transformed into something tender, a refuge for rest. Heinz let out a final sigh, not one of frustration, but of release. His lips curled faintly upward, as though the corners of a dream had already begun to tug at him. The city outside blinked quietly. Stars overhead kept watch, and inside his crooked tower, Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz surrendered to the simplest, most elusive invention of all, sleep. The night deepened, and the Lair seemed to sink further into quiet. The lamp still burned faintly on the desk, though its light had softened, spreading a dim golden haze across the room. Doofenshmirtz, nestled beneath his llama blanket, stirred slightly in his chair. His eyes, though heavy, blinked open once more. Sleep had not quite claimed him yet. Instead, his thoughts drifted the way they often did when silence grew long, wandering back into memory. But these memories felt different than the ones he shared during his usual grand speeches. Without an audience, without the need for dramatic flair, they arrived softer, gentler, not tales to impress or exaggerate, but simple fragments of a past he carried quietly within himself. He rubbed at his temple with one hand, his gaze unfocused as he muttered, "You know, Heinz, you never did have the usual kind of childhood. Not like the ones you see in movies where families go camping or play board games. No. Yours was always a little strange. But still, there were moments, little ones." His voice trailed into silence again, replaced by the hum of the fridge and the faint rustle of curtains shifting with the breeze. He thought of his village, the cobblestone streets, the little bakery that always smelled of strudel, the narrow houses that leaned together as though they needed one another to stay standing. In his mind, those streets were bathed in twilight, just like the city outside now. He could almost hear the sound of the church bell, the way it echoed lazily through the valley at dusk. "I used to sit on the steps outside the bakery sometimes," he murmured, "because even if they didn't let me inside, the smell would drift out, warm, sweet. It made me feel safe, like maybe the world wasn't all bad after all." A smile flickered across his face, faint but genuine. The thought rolled into another. He remembered lying in bed as a child, staring up at a cracked ceiling much like the one he gazed at now. He didn't have a blanket then, not a proper one, but he remembered pulling his coat around him and imagining it was something softer, heavier, protective. "Maybe," he whispered, "maybe that's why I like this llama blanket so much. Maybe it's the blanket I always wished I had." His voice had grown quieter, almost like he was speaking not to himself, but to the memory of the boy he once was. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the images gather. The smell of fresh bread, the cold stone steps beneath him, the sound of wind sweeping across narrow alleys. None of these memories were perfect, but in the silence of the Lair they seemed gentle, a softer shade of a life that had often felt too sharp. When he opened his eyes again, they rested on the framed photo of Vanessa. Her smile, caught in a rare, candid moment from years ago, glimmered faintly in the lamplight. He studied it for a long time, the way her hair fell across her shoulders, the way her eyes carried the same sharpness as his own, but softened by youth. "Vanessa," he whispered, almost like a lullaby, "I hope you're having better nights than me. I hope your blanket is warmer than mine, and your tea tastes sweeter. That's what fathers are supposed to wish for, isn't it?" He chuckled softly at himself, shaking his head. "Listen to me. Getting sentimental at midnight. That's not very evil, Heinz." Still, the warmth lingered, and as his gaze drifted back toward the window and the quiet city beyond, he felt that perhaps being sentimental wasn't so bad after all. Doofenshmirtz shifted in his chair, pulling the llama blanket closer around his shoulders. His tea mug sat empty now, but he still cupped it with both hands as if the memory of warmth lingered in the porcelain. The soft lamplight flickered faintly, brushing against the edges of his cluttered workbench, where inventions sat like harmless sculptures waiting for attention. His thoughts continued their quiet wandering. "You know," he said softly, "people always laugh when I tell them about my tragic childhood. But not everything was bad. There were peaceful moments, too. Strange ones, but still peaceful." He leaned his head back and eyes half closed, and let the memories unfurl like a bedtime story meant only for himself. He remembered lying on the hill just outside his village. He had gone there often as a boy, usually after some unfortunate event, a prank gone wrong, a toy taken away, or the endless tasks his family had found for him. The hill was steep and covered with long grass that tickled his necks, but it gave him the one thing he craved: space. From the top, he could see the valley stretch out below, dotted with little roofs and curling trails of smoke from chimneys. Above him, the stars scattered themselves across the night in thousands of pinpricks. He smiled faintly, recalling how he would try to count them, always losing track somewhere in the hundreds. "I never did get past 320, he muttered, his lips twitching. 321, then poof, gone. Start again. But it didn't matter. I liked starting again. The night sky, he remembered, was like a blanket of its own, vast, cool, endless. It made him feel small, yes, but not in a bad way. Small in a way that meant his problems could shrink, too. He let that memory drift through him now, the feeling of grass against his skin, the smell of earth, the sound of crickets echoing in the distance. "Maybe that's why I talk so much now," he mused. "Because back then, it was just me and the stars, and they never talked back." The words hung in the air for a moment, then melted into silence. His eyes turned once again to the photo of Vanessa. The frame leaned slightly against a jar of spare bolts, out of place yet somehow fitting. He studied her smile, the way her eyes glimmered with amusement in that captured moment. A pang of tenderness filled him, and he whispered, "When you were little, I wanted to show you those stars. But we never went back, did we? I never made the time." His voice faltered, but only briefly. Then he softened. "Maybe you didn't need to. Maybe you already found your own." He adjusted the blanket again, sinking deeper into his chair. The hum of the refrigerator blended with the tick of the clock, both sounds lulling him like background music. He realized with some surprise that the silence didn't feel lonely tonight. It felt companionable, as though the Lair itself had joined him in remembering. He glanced at the half-built Sleep-inator and chuckled. "Funny thing, though. I spent so much of my life trying to invent ways to control everything. Sleep, weather, people, you name it. And yet the best moments I ever had were the ones I couldn't control, sitting on a hill, smelling strudel I wasn't allowed to eat, watching Vanessa laugh when she thought I wasn't looking." His chuckle turned into a sigh, soft but content. "Maybe that's what peace is. Not controlling, not scheming, just noticing. Letting the world happen, even if it's crooked and unfair. He let that idea rest in his chest, heavy but comforting, as the night stretched quietly onward. The silence of the lair had grown thick, but not in an oppressive way. It was the kind of silence that cradled every sound, so that even the smallest shift carried meaning. The creak of Doofenshmirtz's chair as he leaned back, the faint whistle of the wind outside the window, the rhythmic tick of the clock on the wall, all of it came together like a lullaby, wrapping the lair in its own quiet rhythm. Doofenshmirtz exhaled a long, slow breath and let his head rest against the chair's backrest. His eyes flickered toward the ceiling, where shadows danced gently across the plaster. "You know," he murmured softly, "I used to think silence was dangerous, that it meant no one was there, that if things were too quiet, something bad must be waiting to happen. But maybe it's not so bad. Maybe silence is just another way of saying you're safe for now." He smiled faintly at his own words, surprised at their softness. His mind, ever restless, turned once more to memory. He thought of his early days in America, arriving with little more than a suitcase and far too many strange ideas. Everything had seemed enormous then. The streets, the buildings, the noise of it all. But what he remembered most vividly was the first quiet night in his tiny apartment. No bustling family, no crowded village, no constant demands, just him and the hum of a radiator. I was lonely, he admitted quietly, but also free. It was the first time I realized that quiet could belong to me, not just happen around me. The memory lingered, glowing gently in the lamplight of his mind. He shifted again, pulling the llama blanket up to his chin. The warmth seeped into his skin, reminding him of another small comfort. He remembered the first winter he spent with Vanessa as a toddler. She had crawled into his lap one evening, clutching a stuffed toy almost as large as she was, and fallen asleep instantly. He had been too nervous to move, too afraid to wake her. So he had just sat there, frozen, as the hours passed. But the quiet weight of her breathing, the tiny warmth of her resting against him, it had been the most calming silence he had ever known. "Funny," he whispered with a chuckle, "that even a so-called evil scientist can be defeated by a toddler's nap." The sound of his own laughter faded into the stillness, leaving behind a tender ache in his chest. His eyes moved back to the inventions scattered on the table. Each one carried a story, an idea born from frustration, from longing, from trying to fill a gap that life had left. But tonight they seemed more like ornaments, harmless curiosities that cluttered his shelves without demand. "All those inventions," he said softly. "And yet none of them ever built me the thing I wanted most. Peace, belonging, a place where silence feels kind." For a moment he sat with that thought, the truth of it sinking in gently. But then his smile returned. "But maybe," he continued, "I don't need to invent it. Maybe it's already here. Maybe it's been here all along, waiting for me to notice." He let the blanket settle heavier across him, his body finally relaxing into the chair. The stillness no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like presence, the kind of presence that didn't need to say anything to be understood. And so, for the first time in a long while, Doofenshmirtz closed his eyes not out of weariness, but out of ease. The lair felt different now. It wasn't just a laboratory brimming with scattered wires, broken prototypes, and half-labeled boxes. Tonight it seemed softer somehow, as though the shadows had pulled back their sharpness, leaving behind only the gentle suggestion of shapes. Even the cold metal beams overhead seemed less rigid, their edges blurred by the dim light. Doofenshmirtz shifted again, nestling deeper under the llama blanket. His eyes were closed now, but he continued to speak into the room as if the walls themselves had been waiting all evening to listen. "You know," he murmured, "I think I used to fill every silence with noise because I was afraid of what I might hear inside my own head. It was easier to rant, to invent, to make speeches no one asked for. Easier than just listening. But tonight it doesn't feel so scary." A small pause followed only by the tick of the clock. "In fact," he added, voice softening further, "it almost feels like the silence has been waiting for me. Like it was saying, 'Whenever you're ready, I'll be here.'" He let the words linger, then exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that matched the quiet heartbeat of the Lair itself. Memories floated more gently now, less sharp, more like softened edges of a dream. He remembered the lull of waves from a family trip long ago when he had been too young to build inventions, but old enough to feel out of place. He remembered the crackling of a fireplace he'd once fallen asleep beside, his head on a pillow that smelled faintly of cinnamon. He remembered Vanessa humming absent-mindedly as a teenager while sketching in her notebook, her voice so quiet that it blended into the air like background music. Each recollection felt like a small lantern glowing in the dark, dim but enough to guide him. Doofenshmirtz chuckled under his breath. "Maybe I should build a remember-inator, one that only pulls out the good memories, the cozy ones. No goats, no humiliations, no weird birthdays where I was dressed as a lawn gnome. Just the quiet." He paused, smiling. "But then again, maybe I don't need an inator for that either. Maybe all I need is this, just sitting here, just being." The room seemed to sigh with him, the air shifting slightly as though in agreement. His eyelids grew heavier, but he fought against sleep for just a little longer, wanting to savor the quiet while it lasted. "You know," he whispered, voice now barely audible, "for someone who's always tried to take over the tri-state area, I think I've finally conquered something better tonight. My own mind, my own silence." And with that he let the thought settle. No follow-up, no joke, no dramatic flourish. Just quiet. The clock ticked on. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a distant car passed along the road, and in the middle of it all, Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz sat cocooned in his blanket, body slack, heart steady, eyes finally surrendering to rest. The reflections faded like ripples on water, leaving behind only stillness. The kind of stillness that holds a person not in loneliness, but in peace. The night had grown even deeper when Doofenshmirtz stirred again. He hadn't drifted entirely into sleep, just brushed against the edge of it. That soft, in-between place where the body rests, but the mind still wanders. His chair creaked softly as he adjusted under the llama blanket. The lamplight flickered faintly, almost ready to burn itself out, and the Lair was wrapped in a hushed stillness. That was when he heard it. At first, just the lightest scuffle, like a paw against metal, then the almost imperceptible sound of claws clicking softly on the tile floor. Doofenshmirtz's brow furrowed. He knew that sound. He had heard it countless times, often followed by a crash, a struggle, and some elaborate defeat. But tonight, it arrived differently, quieter, gentler. Slowly, Doofenshmirtz sat up, tugging the blanket closer around his shoulders. His eyes moved toward the doorway of the lab, and there, in the soft glow of the lamp, stood a familiar teal figure, Perry the Platypus. The little agent wasn't wearing his hat tonight. He looked smaller somehow without it, more like the pet version that most people knew him as. His eyes blinked slowly, glimmering in the dim light, and his tail swished against the floor with a lazy rhythm. "Perry the Platypus," Doofenshmirtz whispered, his voice not carrying its usual dramatic lilt. What are you doing here at this hour? Shouldn't you be, I don't know, in your secret lair or sleeping in a cozy little platypus bed?" Perry tilted his head slightly as if the question itself was curious. Then, without a sound, he padded softly across the room. His small claws clicked gently with each step, but it wasn't the stomp of confrontation. It was something quieter, almost friendly. Doofenshmirtz blinked, uncertain. Normally, this was the part where an invention was destroyed, a trap was sprung, or a comical tussle unfolded. But there was no invention running tonight, no evil scheme to stop. Just an old scientist wrapped in a blanket, and a platypus who, strangely, looked as though he belonged here. As Perry reached the chair, he paused. His eyes lifted, meeting Doofenshmirtz. For a moment, neither of them moved. The quiet between them carried more weight than any fight they had ever staged. Then, with surprising grace, Perry hopped up onto the edge of the desk, careful not to disturb the clutter of tools and half-finished devices. Doofenshmirtz's lips twitched into a smile. "You know, it's funny. I spend half my life building things to keep you out. And here you are, invited by nothing but silence. No alarms, no lasers, no traps, just walking right in." Perry gave a low, soft trill in response, one of those sounds that wasn't quite a chirp, not quite a growl, but somewhere in between. It was calm, almost soothing. Doofenshmirtz leaned back again, shaking his head. "I must really be tired if I'm imagining friendly visits from my nemesis. Next thing you know, I'll be dreaming that we're, I don't know, playing board games together or knitting matching scarves." He chuckled lightly, but the sound didn't break the stillness. Instead, it melted into it. Perry settled onto the desk, curling his tail around himself. He didn't look like he was here for a mission. He looked like he was simply keeping company. Doofenshmirtz let his eyes linger on the platypus. Something about the sight stirred a quiet warmth in his chest. "You know, Perry, maybe I never said it out loud, but I think I like having you around. Not just for the fights. Those are fun, sure, but it's more than that. When you show up, it feels like someone noticed me, like I matter enough to be stopped. That's not nothing, you know." Perry blinked slowly again, as if acknowledging the words without needing to respond. Doofenshmirtz sighed softly, resting his chin in his hand. Strange, isn't it? The villain and the hero, but in the quiet, without the explosions and the yelling, we're just two creatures sitting in the same room. I don't think that's so bad. And as the lamplight flickered one more time, casting long shadows across the walls, the lair felt less like a lonely place and more like a space that had finally welcomed a guest. Doofenshmirtz shifted in his chair, pulling the llama blanket higher over his shoulders. The lamp on his desk had dimmed to a softer glow, more golden than bright, and it gave the room a warmth that it rarely had during the day. Perry, still perched comfortably on the desk, tilted his head and let out another quiet trill, as if to say, "Yes, I'm here. And no, I'm not leaving yet." The sound made Doofenshmirtz smile, but instead of answering right away, he let himself listen to the silence that followed. The lair had always been full of noises, beeping machinery, sparking wires, the occasional dramatic announcement from a half-working speaker. But tonight all of that seemed to fade into the background. All that remained was the slow tick of the wall clock and the platypus's steady breathing. "You know," Doofenshmirtz said after a pause, "I used to think silence was terrifying. Back when I was a kid in Gimmelstump, Silence usually meant something bad was about to happen, like, oh no, is Father going to put me outside again, or is the lawn gnome staring at me from the shadows? But this silence, it doesn't feel scary, it feels safe. I don't think I've ever thought of silence as safe before. He adjusted in the chair, and the blanket rustled softly. Perry watched, his eyes half-lidded, as though he too were sinking into the calm of the evening. Doofenshmirtz continued, his voice softer now. When you think about it, Perry, most of my life has been noise. Noise from people not listening. Noise from my own inventions blowing up. Noise from me yelling about how unfair everything is. But tonight, I think I finally get why people sit by campfires or listen to waves or whatever. It's not about the sound, it's about the quiet underneath it all. The kind of quiet that holds you instead of leaving you alone. Perry's tail twitched gently, brushing the desk with a faint thump. His gaze didn't waver from Doofenshmirtz, and in that gaze was something that almost felt like understanding. The scientist leaned forward a little, lowering his voice as though confessing a secret. Sometimes I wonder if you get lonely too. I mean, you're always working. Secret missions, gadgets, sneaking around in little tunnels. Does anyone ever sit with you when it's quiet? Or do you just curl up alone when the day is over? Perry blinked slowly. He didn't answer, of course, but the way he shifted, tucking his paws closer under himself, made it look like the question had settled somewhere in him. You're a good listener, you know that? Doofenshmirtz said after a beat. Better than most people. You don't interrupt. You don't argue. You just sit there and let me ramble. He chuckled quietly. Maybe that's why I talk so much when you're around. I finally feel like someone is actually hearing me. For a long stretch of minutes, neither of them moved much. Doofenshmirtz leaned back again, closing his eyes while Perry remained curled on the desk. The platypus's breathing was steady, almost rhythmic, and the sound joined the ticking clock as part of the Lair's new lullaby. Eventually, Doofenshmirtz opened one eye and glanced over. You know, if anyone else saw us like this, they'd probably laugh. The evil scientist and the secret agent platypus just hanging out. Not fighting, not chasing, not blowing anything up. Just two old friends? He hesitated on the word, but didn't take it back. Yeah, friends. His voice softened even further, nearly a whisper. Maybe that's what tonight is. Not about schemes or failures or even redemption, just sharing the quiet with someone who understands it too. The Lair, once a place of noise and chaos, now held them both in a gentle stillness. The moment stretched like warm fabric, soft and unbroken, until it felt less like an interruption of their usual roles, and more like something that had always been meant to happen. Doofenshmirtz rubbed his eyes slowly, not from exhaustion this time, but from a strange heaviness that felt more like comfort than weariness. He shifted in the chair, the blanket slipping down one arm, and for a moment he just watched Perry sitting so calmly on the desk. The platypus had closed his eyes, his breathing steady, his little chest rising and falling, with the rhythm of someone who trusted their surroundings enough to let their guard down. The sight caught Doofenshmirtz off guard. Perry, his nemesis, the one who had foiled countless inventions, sitting there so peacefully as though he had nothing to fear in this lair. It made the scientist's voice soften even further when he finally spoke. You know, Perry, I think I've been looking at this whole thing wrong. Perry's ear twitched at the sound of his name, though he didn't open his eyes. I've always thought of you as the obstacle, Doofenshmirtz continued, resting his chin on his hand. The thing that stood between me and, well, world domination, or at least the tri-state area domination. But maybe Maybe you're not the obstacle. Maybe you're the anchor." He paused, letting the words settle. "Because if you weren't there to stop me, I'd just keep going, keep building, keep scheming, keep yelling at the universe. I'd wear myself out until there was nothing left of me. But with you, it's like you remind me that someone's paying attention, that someone is willing to wrestle me back into place when I start flying too close to the sun." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Of course I'd never admit this during one of our fights. Oh no, then it's all curse you, Perry the Platypus," and dramatic fist shaking. "But here now, I can say it. You keep me human, Perry. You keep me grounded." The platypus's tail flicked lightly against the desk, a sound so small that it barely rose above the clock's ticking. But it felt like agreement, or at least acknowledgement. Doofenshmirtz leaned back again, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling. "It's funny. I used to think that the worst part of life was being ignored, being invisible. I built all these inventions just to make sure people would notice me. Loud inventions, big explosions, dramatic schemes. But now I think maybe being noticed quietly is better, like tonight. You didn't barge in. You didn't yell or smash anything. You just showed up, sat down, and that was enough. That's more than enough." For a moment, silence returned, gentle and weightless. The only movement was the soft flicker of the lamp and the steady rhythm of Perry's breath. "You know," Doofenshmirtz said finally, "if I were a different kind of person, maybe I'd say thank you. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for not letting me vanish into the noise, but don't let it go to your head, all right? I still have a reputation to keep." He smirked faintly. Perry opened one eye, gave a soft chirr, and then closed it again as if to humor him. The sight made Doofenshmirtz's chest warm in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. "Look at us," he whispered. "The great villain and his nemesis, sitting in the same room, wrapped in silence like it's the rarest treasure in the world. Maybe it is. Maybe quiet company is the one thing we all chase without even knowing it." The minutes stretched on, peaceful and unhurried. For once, Doofenshmirtz didn't feel the urge to fill them with more words. He simply let the silence cradle them both, until it felt less like an absence and more like the presence of something deeper. Connection, unspoken but undeniable. The night had grown deeper, though neither Doofenshmirtz nor Perry seemed to notice at first. Outside the Lair's windows, the city's glow softened into faint halos of light, as though the world itself was preparing for rest. Inside, the lamp on the desk cast its final pool of gold, holding them in its gentle circle as if refusing to let the quiet moment fade too quickly. Doofenshmirtz gave a long, slow sigh, not the kind laced with frustration or defeat, but the kind that comes when the heart finally feels lighter. He adjusted the llama blanket once more, tucking it close around his shoulders, and glanced at Perry. The platypus had dozed off halfway, his little form curled up neatly on the desk. His breaths were deep and steady, the kind that lulled anyone nearby toward sleep without even trying. For a long time, Doofenshmirtz simply watched. He didn't feel the need to move or to talk or to break the spell. Instead, he let the silence stretch, realizing that this quiet companionship was rarer than any invention he could ever build. Eventually, he whispered, almost to himself, "You know, Perry, I think tonight has been one of the best nights I can remember, not because of anything grand, but because, well, it didn't need to be grand. It was just enough." The words hung in the air, soft and fragile. Perry stirred faintly, his tail twitching, but he didn't wake. His steady breathing continued, weaving into the room like the background music of peace itself. Doofenshmirtz leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Maybe that's the secret, huh? Maybe life isn't about conquering the tri-state area, or making sure people know your name, or even proving anything. Maybe it's about finding the moments where you're not alone, where you can sit in the quiet, and for once, you don't feel like you're missing anything. A small smile crept onto his face, and for the first time in what felt like years, it wasn't tinged with irony or bitterness. It was simple, genuine. The ticking clock marked the passing seconds, each one blending seamlessly into the next. The Lair, so often chaotic and filled with the whir of machinery, had transformed into something unexpected, a place of rest. And for once, Doofenshmirtz didn't fight the pull of drowsiness. His eyelids grew heavy, his thoughts slowed, and the warmth of the blanket combined with the quiet companionship of Perry to lull him toward sleep. Before he drifted completely, he murmured, "Don't tell anyone about this, all right? Just between us." The great Dr. Doofenshmirtz and his nemesis, sharing a peaceful night. If people found out, they'd think I'd gone soft. He chuckled softly, the sound fading into a yawn. But maybe soft isn't so bad. Perry gave one last small trill in his sleep, as if to agree, and then all was quiet again. The Lair settled fully into stillness. No beeping machines, no dramatic speeches, no interruptions, just the steady rhythm of two unlikely companions breathing in the same space, held together by the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but whole. And as sleep finally took Doofenshmirtz, the night carried them both gently, like a lullaby sung without words, into the kind of dreams that only come when one is not truly alone. The first blush of dawn was still hours away, yet inside Doofenshmirtz's lair, the atmosphere had shifted again. The quiet night Perry had brought had left its mark, softening the edges of Doofenshmirtz's restless mind. But as the inventor slowly woke from his light doze, still wrapped in his blanket, a familiar itch began to return, the itch to invent. Doofenshmirtz blinked blearily at the desk, where Perry still dozed peacefully. He rubbed his eyes and whispered, "Huh, he's still here. My nemesis, sleeping on my desk. I mean, what a twist, right? Who would have guessed this would be my Friday night?" His gaze shifted to the corner of the lair where unused parts and half-finished devices rested in quiet stacks. Normally, those piles screamed of deadlines, plans, and frustration. Tonight, however, they looked different, like possibilities waiting to be gently reshaped. He straightened a little in his chair, the blanket slipping, and murmured, "You know what this night needs? An innator. But not just any innator. No. This calls for something peaceful." He tapped his chin thoughtfully, eyes narrowing with a mix of theatrical seriousness and sleepy softness. "A sleep-inator." The words felt strange coming from his mouth. Usually his inventions leaned toward destruction, inconvenience, or at the very least, dramatic declarations of mild annoyance. But the idea of an innator built solely for rest, it sparked something different in him. "Imagine it, Perry," he whispered. "Careful not to disturb the platypus. A ray that doesn't destroy, doesn't shrink, doesn't even mildly irritate. Instead, it makes people cozy, like impossibly cozy. Imagine the entire tri-state area just taking a nap at the same time. No yelling, no arguing, no cutting in line at the slushy machine. Just quiet breathing, synchronized snoring. Oh, it would be beautiful." He smiled dreamily at the thought. For once, the fantasy didn't involve triumph or revenge. It involved peace, something he had long chased without realizing it. He pushed himself out of the chair, careful not to jostle Perry, and shuffled over to the pile of parts. His blanket trailed behind him like a cape, though far less dramatic than his usual villain attire. He dug through the components, coils, tubes, wires, a half-empty box of bolts, even a dusty pillow he had accidentally glued to a circuit board weeks ago. "Huh, this could work," he said softly, gathering pieces with surprising care. He carried them to the workbench and began to assemble them, not with his usual frantic energy, but with deliberate slowness. The steady clink of metal and the occasional sigh filled the room, a quiet rhythm that almost matched Perry's breathing. As the device began to take shape, he spoke more to himself than anyone else. "It needs to be gentle. No harsh, zapping sounds, no sparks flying everywhere. Just a soft whoosh. Maybe a lullaby tone? Yes, that would be nice. Something soothing, like a grandmother humming you to sleep." He paused and smiled faintly. "Not that I would know what that sounds like, but you know. Imagination." He screwed in the final piece of the base, sat back, and admired the beginnings of his creation. The Sleep-inator, though far from complete, already looked different from his usual machines. Instead of jagged angles and intimidating spikes, it had rounded edges, softer curves, and even a small, glowing orb at its center that pulsed like a heartbeat. "Wow," Doofenshmirtz whispered. "This one's kind of pretty." Behind him, Perry stirred, opening one eye to glance at the inventor. Doofenshmirtz caught the look and grinned sheepishly. "Don't give me that face, Perry. Even villains can appreciate aesthetics." The platypus gave a quiet trill before curling back into his nap. Doofenshmirtz turned back to his invention, his voice lowering to a murmur. "Maybe this is the invention I was always supposed to build. Something not meant to impress or conquer, but to rest, to make the world slow down, just for a little while. Because, let's face it, Perry, the world runs too fast. People shout, they rush, they fight. But maybe, just maybe, if everyone could pause for a nap, things wouldn't feel so heavy." His hand lingered on the machine's glowing orb, the warmth of it reflecting in his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't inventing to be noticed. He was inventing because he wanted peace. For himself, for Perry, maybe even for everyone else. And in the quiet Lair, with the city outside growing ever stiller, the beginnings of the Sleep-inator glowed softly, like a beacon of rest yet to come. The Lair seemed unusually quiet as Doofenshmirtz continued to work. The Sleep-inator was slowly transforming from a pile of mismatched parts into something recognizable, though admittedly it still bore the odd charm of all his inventions, wires sticking out at odd angles, a knob labeled mystery setting, and a switch that probably didn't need to exist, but looked impressive anyway. Doofenshmirtz tightened a bolt and then sat back, holding his wrench thoughtfully. "You know," he mused softly, "it's funny. I've built inators to freeze, shrink, explode, even mildly inconvenience people. But I've never built one that would just help, like no strings attached, just a nap button for life." He gave a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Of course, I probably should have done this years ago. Think of how many stress-induced arguments at the grocery store could have been avoided. You wouldn't have angry customers fighting over the last jar of mustard. No, they'd all be snoozing happily in the condiment aisle." He snorted quietly at the mental image, but there was a strange warmth in the joke, too. He realized, as he tightened another screw, that this was the first time he wasn't imagining chaos as the result of his work, but calm. Behind him, Perry stirred again, lifting his head briefly to watch. The platypus made no move to interfere, he simply observed. Normally, by now, he would have launched into a full-on mission of sabotage, diving into battle with acrobatics and gadgets. But something in Doofenshmirtz's manner was different. There was no dramatic monologue, no evil laugh, just soft tinkering, like someone fixing a music box. "Don't worry, Perry," Doofenshmirtz said gently, noticing the look. "This isn't one of my usual, schemes. I mean, sure, it's technically still an inventor, but this one's not for taking over the tri-state area. It's more like, well, taking over insomnia, and that, my nemesis, is a cause worth fighting for." Perry blinked slowly, then let out a quiet sound that was almost approving. He curled back into his spot, seemingly at ease. Doofenshmirtz smiled faintly. "See? Even you get it. You spent how many years chasing me, fighting, climbing through elaborate traps. You must be tired, too. Honestly, Perry, we're not enemies tonight. We're, well, roommates in the land of exhaustion." He placed the last piece onto the frame and flicked a switch. The orb at the center glowed brighter, pulsing in soft waves of golden light. It wasn't harsh or overwhelming. It shimmered gently, like the flicker of fireflies on a summer evening. The machine hummed faintly, and instead of the usual sputtering or sparking, it released a low melodic tone, almost like a lullaby without words. Doofenshmirtz's eyes widened. Oh, wow, that's actually nice. Did I just invent something pleasant?" He sat back, stunned for a moment, then he began nodding vigorously. Yes, I did. It's like a bedtime ray, a relaxation beam up." He paused, shaking his head with a small smile. No, keep it simple. Sleep-inator. Stick with what works." He leaned closer to the device, lowering his voice as though afraid to break the moment. "It's peaceful. Really peaceful. You know, Perry, I don't think I've ever sat next to one of my inventions and just breathed like this. Usually there are sparks, explosions, chaos. But this feels like it was made for silence." The hum of the Sleep-inator filled the lair, not as noise, but as atmosphere. It wrapped around the inventor and the platypus like a soft blanket of sound, complementing the glow of the orb. For once, the lair didn't feel like a villain's den. It felt like a sanctuary. Doofenshmirtz rested his elbows on the table, chin in his hands, gazing at the machine. Maybe the tri-state area doesn't need conquering. Maybe it just needs a nap. And maybe I need one too. He stifled a yawn, the irony not lost on him. The Sleep-inator was working already, if not on the world, and certainly on him. And for the first time in a long while, Doofenshmirtz wondered if this was what real invention was supposed to feel like. Not about power, but about peace. Doofenshmirtz sat for a long moment, chin propped on his hand, staring at the glowing orb of the Sleep-inator. The soft hum filled the lair, and for once, he didn't feel compelled to leap up and declare some villainous plot. Instead, he felt calm, so calm, in fact, that his eyelids fluttered heavily for a second before he forced them back open. Okay, he mumbled, rubbing his face. Note to self, do not test the Sleep-inator on yourself without, safety goggles or a very strong cup of coffee. Perry gave a quiet, questioning chirp from the desk. He hadn't moved much, though one eye peeked open. He tilted his head as though to say, "So what now?" Doofenshmirtz pointed toward the machine. "Well, Perry, the logical next step is to test it. I mean, you can't just build something and then not try it. That's like rule number 1 of inventing, or maybe rule number 2. Rule number 1 is always label your self-destruct button. Trust me, you don't want to mix those up with your microwave timer." He stood stretching and shuffled over to a section of the lair where he usually tested his inventions. The space was still littered with scorch marks and broken contraptions from past failures, but tonight The atmosphere was different. Instead of bracing himself for disaster, he felt strangely hopeful. He looked back at Perry, who was now sitting up fully, watching with his usual mix of wariness and patience. "Oh, don't give me that look. This isn't going to be one of those, oh, oops, I blew up half the Lair nights. No, this is going to be pleasant. I can feel it." He positioned the Sleep-inator on a stand, making sure it faced the testing area. He pulled out a small, somewhat mangled clipboard, flipping through a page of messy notes. "All right, let's see. Test subject chair. Yes, I know it's not glamorous, but you have to start somewhere." He dragged an old swivel chair into the center of the floor. It wobbled slightly on one leg, but stayed upright. Doofenshmirtz adjusted his goggles, flicked a couple of switches, and then, with an exaggerated flourish, pulled the activation lever. The orb pulsed brighter, and a soft beam of golden light washed over the chair. Instead of sparking or catching fire, as many of his tests usually did, the chair simply slumped. Its creaky backrest reclined slightly, the cushion flattening as though someone invisible had sunk into it with a sigh. Doofenshmirtz's jaw dropped. "Oh, did you see that, Perry?" The chair relaxed. "I mean, sure, it's an inanimate object, but look at it. It's practically lounging. If that isn't proof this works, I don't know what is." Perry blinked slowly, but seemed quietly impressed. Doofenshmirtz rubbed his hands together, grinning. "All right, phase 2. Something living. Something small, something not me." He glanced around, eyes landing on a houseplant perched on a shelf. "Perfect. Fern test number 1. He carefully set the plant in the beam's path and activated the Sleep-inator again. This time, the golden light bathed the leaves, and to his amazement, the plant's drooping fronds lifted slightly, then slowly settled into an even softer droop, as if the fern itself had sighed contentedly into a nap. Doofenshmirtz clapped his hands together, grinning from ear to ear. Yes. This is it, Perry. This is my magnum opus. Forget evil plans, forget tri-state domination. This is my legacy. Doofenshmirtz, bringer of naps." He spun dramatically, arms wide. "The newspapers will write about it. Local evil scientist accidentally ends world stress crisis. Children will cheer, parents will applaud, cats will purr in synchronization." Perry rolled his eyes, but his beak twitched in the faintest suggestion of amusement. Doofenshmirtz turned back to the machine, his smile softening. "But maybe this isn't about the newspapers. Maybe it's about me. About finally making something that doesn't break people's trust, or cause chaos, or make me look ridiculous. Something that actually helps." He paused, staring at the beam of light as it faded. His voice lowered. "You know, Perry, I spent most of my life thinking the only way I'd ever matter was if I forced people to notice me. That's why I built inventions that shouted, that exploded, that demanded attention. But maybe people don't need another loud thing. Maybe they need quiet. And maybe so do I." The platypus gave a soft sound, something between a trill and a sigh. Doofenshmirtz chuckled softly, blinking away a suspicious hint of moisture in his eyes. "Don't go getting sentimental on me, Perry. I'm still technically your nemesis, remember? But thanks for sticking around tonight. It's nice not being alone with this." The Sleep-inator pulsed faintly again, filling the Lair with that golden glow, and as the light touched both inventor and nemesis, the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt whole. Doofenshmirtz stood in front of the Sleep-inator, hands resting on his hips, his expression caught between pride and disbelief. The machine glowed steadily, casting a golden shimmer across the Lair. For once, he wasn't bracing himself for sparks, for explosions, or for the sound of something catastrophically breaking. Instead, the air felt safe, soft, almost dreamy. He turned to Perry, who was still perched on the desk, watching with steady eyes. "Well, Perry, I think it's time for the real test. And no, before you panic, I don't mean you. I wouldn't point a brand new inventor at my nemesis. What kind of villain do you take me for?" He paused, rubbing his chin. "Well, okay, technically I would. I have. Multiple times. But this one's different." He adjusted a dial on the side of the machine, lowering the intensity. I think maybe I'll try it myself. Just a little. After all, if it's safe enough for Fern, it's safe enough for Heinz Doofenshmirtz. And if it works," his voice softened, "maybe I'll finally sleep through the night." He pulled over a nearby chair and sat down, facing the machine. The glow bathed him, and instantly he felt the weight of years pressing down. Not in a heavy way, but in the way a blanket gently drapes over tired shoulders. His eyelids tremble, the hum of the Sleep-inator sinking with the slow rhythm of his heartbeat. "Oh, wow," he whispered, his voice slurring slightly. "It's like a lullaby for the brain. I can feel the stress. It's just gone." Perry tilted his head, watching carefully. Normally, this would be the point where he'd swoop in, disable the machine, and tie up Doofenshmirtz before reporting back. But tonight, it didn't feel right. There was no evil scheme to stop, no threat looming over the tri-state area. There was just a tired man, finally letting himself rest. Doofenshmirtz blinked at Perry through heavy lids. "You know, Perry, I think I get it now. All those years chasing after attention, after proving I was worth something. Maybe what I really needed was just this, a quiet moment. Someone nearby who doesn't mind sitting in the silence with me." His head lolled back slightly, his words slowing. "It's funny. All this time I thought our rivalry was what gave me purpose. But maybe it was just having company, even if it was you, Perry the Platypus, my oddly reliable nemesis." His voice trailed off into a soft snore. For a moment the Lair was still, lit only by the gentle glow of the machine. Perry remained on the desk, gazing at Doofenshmirtz. He could have taken advantage of the moment, wrapped things up as he always did, but instead he padded quietly across the floor, climbed onto a nearby chair, and settled himself within the warm circle of light. The golden hum wrapped around both of them, carrying the tension of the day away. Perry's eyes drifted shut, his breathing slowing to match Doofenshmirtz's. For once, there was no mission, no gadgets, no dramatic fight. Just two unlikely companions, resting side by side in a moment of peace. The Sleep-inator pulsed softly, like a heart beating steadily into the quiet. It didn't conquer the tri-state area, and it didn't make headlines. But in its glow, an exhausted inventor and his nemesis found something far more important: rest. And in that silence, the Lair didn't feel like a place of schemes or failure. It felt like home. The golden light of the Sleep-inator dimmed into a softer glow, wrapping the Lair in a blanket of warmth and hush. Doofenshmirtz slumped in his chair, chin tilted toward his chest, eyelids fluttering in that slow, heavy rhythm of someone just on the edge of dreams. His voice, however, did not completely vanish. Even in half-sleep he muttered softly, words spilling out like loose marbles rolling down a quiet slope. Perry, you know, when I was a little boy in Gimmelstump, nobody ever told me bedtime stories." His tone was unusually tender, threaded with a drowsy slur. "No, my parents thought the best way to put me to sleep was to make me count wallpaper cracks. And let me tell you, Perry the Platypus, Cracks are not good storytellers. They don't have character development. They don't have dramatic arcs. They just sit there on the wall, all crackly. He gave a soft chuckle, half a snore, half a laugh. Perry, curled up nearby, tilted an ear but didn't move. "Sometimes I wonder," Doofenshmirtz continued, voice lowering into a thoughtful hum, "if I had been told bedtime stories, would I have grown up different? Maybe instead of becoming an evil scientist, I would have become, I don't know, a professional storyteller. Yes, imagine it. Heinz Doofenshmirtz, world's most beloved bedtime narrator. Children everywhere would drift into dreams as I tell them about goats or shoes, or goats wearing shoes. People love that stuff." He yawned loudly, stretching out his arms before letting them flop against his sides. "But no, instead I made innators. Don't get me wrong, Perry, I do love inventing. I love the whirring and the clanking and the occasional kaboom. But sometimes, when I'm honest with myself, I wonder if maybe I just want people to listen to me, to hear me, even if it was because I strapped a giant megaphone onto the moon." His head rolled lazily to one side, eyes closing completely now. The words continued as though they belonged more to his dreams than his waking self. "You're a good listener, Perry the Platypus. You don't interrupt. You don't laugh at me too much. Well, okay, you give me the look. But that's okay. The look is better than silence. The look means someone's paying attention." The steady hum of the Sleep-inator filled the pause like a lullaby playing beneath his voice. "I think that's why I monologue so much. Everybody says, 'Oh, Heinz, you talk too much. You explain too much. You go on and on.' But maybe," his voice dropped to a whisper, "maybe I just want someone there when I talk. Someone who doesn't walk away, even if it's my nemesis in a little fedora." He let out a sleepy laugh. "You know, Perry, if I had to pick one thing about our whole nemesis ship, it's that you keep showing up day after day, even when my inventors are ridiculous, even when they fizzle or explode. You're there, like clockwork, like some reliable platypus-shaped alarm." And he yawned mid-sentence, blinking heavily. "That's kind of comforting." His words slowed, blending into the hum of the machine. "So maybe tonight, maybe this is my bedtime story. I talk, you listen, and somewhere in between, we both fall asleep. That doesn't sound so bad, does it?" The silence stretched for a moment. Perry adjusted slightly, his head tucking in against his chest. The golden glow shimmered like starlight, spilled across the lair. Doofenshmirtz's voice, now nearly a murmur, added one last sleepy thought. Goats in shoes. Bestseller. Definitely." And with that he drifted deeper into dreams, his breathing evening out, the words slipping away into quiet. The lair was quiet except for the steady hum of the Sleep-inator and the soft rhythm of Doofenshmirtz's voice. His eyes were closed now, his body fully slack in the chair, but his mind wandered in that peculiar way only dreams could allow. His words floated between sense and nonsense, weaving together a monologue that sounded half like memory, half like a bedtime fable. "I remember one time when I was 7, he began, his voice trailing like a whispery breeze. "My parents told me I had to sleep outside, with the goats. Not because it was some kind of fun camping trip. No, they just said, 'Heinz, the goats need company, and you look like someone who can baa convincingly.' So there I was, lying in the straw, pretending to baa in my little boy voice. The goats didn't appreciate it. They headbutted me. Goats are very judgmental creatures, Perry the Platypus." He gave a soft huff of laughter, the kind that rises unbidden even in sleep. But you know what's funny? I think maybe that was my first bedtime story. Not a story told to me, but a story I had to live. A strange, itchy, sneezy story in a goat pen. And I survived it. And now I tell it to you, and it becomes a bedtime story after all. Isn't that strange? How things circle back. Perry blinked slowly from his perch, the steady glow reflecting in his eyes. He didn't interrupt. He never did. Doofenshmirtz's voice shifted, dreamier now. Sometimes I think of Gimmelstum, the cobblestone streets, the crooked houses, the way the air smelled of cabbage soup and, occasionally, despair. But in dreams, it looks different, softer, like the houses lean because they're tired, not because the builders were lazy. The streets shine a little under the moon. Even the goats wear little pajamas. He chuckled again, a raspy, sleepy sound. Yes, pajama goats. Much less headbutting, much more cuddly. I would have slept better back then if goats had pajamas, everyone would. His voice quieted for a beat. The silence filled with the comforting pulse of the machine. Then, softer still, do you ever dream, Perry the Platypus? I wonder what platypuses dream about. Streams? Warm rocks in the sun? Giant clams? Or maybe you dream about this. About being here, listening to a silly man talk himself to sleep. A sigh slipped from him, heavy and content. If you do, then I guess we're sharing the same dream. A dream where I'm not so alone. A dream where someone actually stays. The corners of his mouth curled faintly in a drowsy smile. That's what bedtime should be, not just the sleeping, but the staying, the togetherness. I think maybe I missed out on that as a kid. No one stayed, not even the goats. They always wandered off. He shifted slightly, curling deeper into his blanket. His voice was lower now, rumbling, dream-heavy. But you're still here. Perry the Platypus, you stayed. And so, I can stay asleep. The hum of the Sleep-inator deepened, a soothing drone like distant waves. Doofenshmirtz's voice grew softer, almost indistinct, words melting into dream thoughts. And in this dream, there's no evil schemes, no failures, no loneliness, just pajamas, goats in pajamas, and you, listening. The last word lingered in the golden glow, dissolving into silence. Or the Lair seemed to dissolve around him. The humming of the Sleep-inator was steady, but in Doofenshmirtz's drifting mind it transformed into something else, like the low strum of a lullaby played on strings the size of skyscrapers. His breathing was slow and deep, yet his voice kept wandering, tethered half to the room and half to his dreams. Oh, this is strange, he muttered, lips curving in a sleepy smile. The goats in pajamas. They are marching now, a whole parade, Perry the Platypus. Yes, a parade just for me. They have little trumpets and woolly slippers. The slippers make no sound, but the trumpets do. It's very festive. And at the front of the parade is you. You, Perry, wearing a sash that says Nemesis of the Year. His head tilted back slightly, a chuckle bubbling up from his chest. Of course you won. You win every year. They should just engrave your name permanently. But in the dream, you don't fight me. You lead the parade, and everyone claps, and I wave from a float shaped like... Ah, yes, like one of my innators. The bedtime innator, maybe. Sprays lavender mist into the crowd. Nobody boos. They just smile. Can you imagine, Perry? They're happy to see me. That's different. The smile on his lips wavered into something softer and something that carried a trace of longing. Maybe that's what I always wanted. Not domination, not revenge. Just to float in a parade. Someone to clap when I wave. The dream carried him further. His voice, though hushed, described it like he was narrating for himself. And oh, now the streets of Gimmelstump aren't gloomy anymore. They shine like they're sprinkled with sugar. The crooked houses straighten up a little, as if they know people are watching. Even the clouds are friendly. They puff into shapes. Look, Perry, that one looks like a platypus with a monocle. Distinguished, very distinguished. He yawned mid-sentence, the sound stretching out long and drowsy.
You know, Perry the Platypus, he whispered. I think dreams are like editing life. You take the sad parts, the crooked parts, the lonely parts, and you smooth them over. You add pajamas. You add parades. You give yourself the things you didn't get when you were small. And then, maybe you rest a little easier. Silence hung for a few moments. Only the steady hush of the machine filled the air. Then Doofenshmirtz mumbled again, slower this time. Strange thing is, I don't feel like the villain here. Not in the dream. Not when you're leading the parade. Maybe bedtime stories aren't about heroes and villains at all. Maybe they're just about not being alone before sleep. The words trailed into a sigh. His hand twitched slightly as if waving in the dream. Thank you for listening, Perry. Even here. The glow around him pulsed faintly, like the Lair itself was listening too. His voice thinned into a whisper, tangled with the surreal warmth of dreams. Goats in slippers, Perry with a sash, and me waving, not plotting. That's nice. The sentence melted into quiet breathing. The room was nearly silent now, save for the steady lull of the Sleep-inator. Doofenshmirtz's breaths had deepened into that rhythm where wakefulness and dreaming blurred. Yet his voice lingered, fragile and soft, like the very last sparks of a candle before the flame went out. Perry, it's getting quieter, he whispered. His words stumbled over drowsiness, but they pressed on. Not the bad kind of quiet. Not like when I was a boy in my tower room with only the dripping faucet for company. No, this quiet feels warm, like a blanket. Like someone tucked me in and said, "Don't worry, Heinz. I'll stay right here." His head lolled against the chair, and a faint smile ghosted across his face. I never had that before. Not really. No one to guard the room from shadows. No one to tell me the world would wait until morning. But now, with you sitting there, Perry, with your little fedora and your quiet watching, it feels like I have it, even if just this once. The dream tugged harder, painting imagery across his drifting words. The parade fades now. The goats in pajamas are bowing goodnight. The houses in Gimmelstump are blowing out their lanterns. Even the platypus-shaped cloud is yawning, stretching across the sky like a giant pillow. Everything is slowing down, saying, "Rest, rest, it's time." He sighed, long and weightless. Do you know what's funny, Perry the Platypus? I think this is my favorite invention. Not the shrinkinator, not the hot dog on a stickinator, not even the giant dispenser of evil lasers inator. No, it's this. The Sleep-inator. Because it doesn't hurt anyone. It doesn't take anything away. It just gives back. It gives sleep. It gives peace. And maybe it even gives me a little piece of what I missed. His voice fell almost to nothing, words slowing like a record winding down. And you gave it to me, too. By staying, by listening, by being here when I talk too much. The last chuckle was broken by a yawn. His eyelids fluttered once, then settled, heavy as stone. Still, the very last fragments of thought slipped free, a childlike confession carried into the dark. Maybe I'm not such a bad guy. Maybe I just needed someone to stay until I fell asleep. A pause. Only breathing now, long and steady. Then faintly, with all the softness of surrender. Good night, Perry the Platypus. The lamplight glowed gently, wrapping the lair in a cocoon of amber warmth. Perry sat watchful but calm, his small eyes blinking slowly, like a guardian who understood the value of silence. Doofenshmirtz had finally drifted past the boundary of words, slipping fully into sleep. The machine hummed low, softer now, like it too was ready to rest. The parade, the goats, the pajama clouds, all folded neatly into dreamland. And there among them, Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz slept soundly, his monologue at last dissolved into the language of dreams. The lair had grown softer, as though the very walls themselves had decided to sleep. Shadows stretched like blankets over the corners, and the hum of the Sleep-inator quieted to a gentle throb, steady as a heartbeat. Even the faint buzz of the city outside seemed muted, like the night was showing respect for one tired inventor, finally finding his rest. Doofenshmirtz's chair tilted back slightly, his lanky frame bundled in the llama blanket, chin resting against his chest. His lips moved every so often, but no real words escaped now, only the restless mutterings of someone slipping between dreams and memory. Beside him, Perry the Platypus sat, silent and still. He hadn't left even after his nemesis had drifted into sleep. He remained on guard, though the kind of guard that needed no action, just quiet company. The lab was peaceful in a way it rarely was. No sparks flew from inventions, no dramatic shouting echoed through the halls, no alarms blared announcing another failed scheme. Instead, it was filled with the rhythm of rest. The machines lined up against the walls glowed faintly like nightlights. A little puff of steam rose occasionally from the Sleep-inator, releasing the faintest trace of lavender into the air, barely enough to notice but enough to soften the senses. Doof shifted in his chair, sighing softly in his sleep. His dreams were calmer now than they had been earlier. No chaotic parades of goats, no booming crowds or oversized inators rolling down the street. Instead, he seemed to be carried somewhere quieter. Maybe a meadow, maybe a place where childhood shadows could not reach him. His face, usually so animated with scheming or complaining, was slack and peaceful, almost boyish. The crease between his brows had eased. His jaw, so often clenched with frustration, rested loose. Good night, he mumbled into the blanket, though who he was addressing was unclear. Perhaps Perry, perhaps his dream, perhaps the memory of someone who had never tucked him in. The words floated and vanished like smoke. Perry blinked slowly, adjusting his little fedora as he leaned back against a stack of blueprints. He didn't need to understand every word, he simply stayed. He knew in his quiet way that this was what Doofenshmirtz had needed far more than any battle. A night where nothing exploded, no one argued, and sleep wasn't chased away by loneliness. Around the lair, everything seemed to sink to that stillness. A draft crept through the window, cool but not harsh, stirring a hanging blueprint that flapped gently like a curtain. A lone moth drifted lazily past the lamplight, then disappeared into the shadows. Even the moonlight through the glass seemed softened, casting a pale glow over the inventor's blanket. And so the minutes passed, slowly, carefully, quietly. A strange and precious calm for a man whose life had been anything but calm. His chest rose and fell with steady rhythm, a melody far simpler than any of his inventions, but far more valuable. It wasn't victory, not in the traditional sense. There were no medals, no applause, no grand unveiling of an invention that finally worked the way he had planned. But here in the stillness, Doofenshmirtz had found a different sort of triumph, the triumph of rest, and perhaps, without realizing it, the triumph of being cared for, even in silence.
The night stretched on, and with it, a promise. For once, sleep would stay. Sleep had taken hold of Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz completely now, drawing him into a world woven from fragments of memory, imagination, and quiet longing. The hum of the Sleep-inator followed him into the dreamscape, reshaping itself into something softer, like the purr of a lullaby sung by a machine that finally understood gentleness. At first his dream was hazy, colored only by pale moonlight and mist. Then shapes began to form, rolling meadows that stretched further than his eyes could see, painted in deep indigo and soft lavender, glowing faintly as if the stars themselves had settled into the grass. Each blade shimmered when the wind touched it, releasing little sparks of starlight that floated upward like fireflies. Doof wandered through the meadow in his dream, barefoot, his lab coat trailing behind him, like a cape that had forgotten its purpose. He looked younger somehow, not in his features, but in his posture. There was less weight on his shoulders, less bitterness etched into his stance. He didn't stumble forward with frustration or stomp with determination. Instead, he walked lightly, as though each step was guided by the earth itself. Off in the distance, he saw a figure, small, teal, unmistakable. Perry the Platypus, hat and all, stood quietly in the field, waiting. Doof smiled without hesitation, as though in this dream he had no need for dramatic introductions. "Ah, Perry the Platypus," he said, his voice warm, unguarded. "You're here too. Of course you are." The platypus gave his familiar blink, that slow, understanding gesture that carried more weight than words ever could. He didn't attack, didn't prepare for a fight. He simply turned and began to walk, inviting Doof to follow, and he did, without question. Together they moved across the dreamscape. The meadow shifted around them, bending like pages in a storybook. One moment they passed a grove of tall silver trees, whose leaves chimed like wind bells. The next, a quiet brook meandered past their feet, its waters glowing faintly with the constellations instead of stones. The stars themselves seemed to gather in the stream, swirling lazily before drifting back into the sky. And Doofenshmirtz knelt at the brook and dipped his hand into the glowing water. It felt cool and weightless, like liquid moonlight. He laughed softly. "Can you believe it, Perry? A brook that actually sparkles like all those poetic descriptions people talk about. I always thought that was exaggerated, but no, it's real here." Perry tilted his head as if amused by the inventor's wonder, and together they lingered, watching the water drift by in silence. For once, Doof didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. His usual monologues, his stories of misfortune and comically tragic childhood memories, stayed quiet. Here in this dream, there was no need to explain himself, no audience to convince. He could simply be wandering through a world that asked nothing of him except to rest. Above them, the sky shifted into deeper hues. Stars brightened, twinkling in lazy constellations that shaped themselves into odd patterns. For a moment, Doof thought he saw one cluster form the outline of his old ocelot-inator, another that resembled his first science fair volcano. He chuckled. "Even in my dreams, my inventions follow me around." But instead of frustration, the thought only filled him with warmth. Perhaps in this place they weren't failures. Perhaps they were just part of his story, stitched into the sky like memories too fond to let go. The meadow stretched on, the brook winding endlessly. Perry stayed at his side, and Doofenshmirtz's steps slowed, his eyelids heavy even in the dream. Here rest seemed to deepen, pulling him further and further into peace. He tilted his head back, gazing at the sky. For the
first time," he whispered, his voice carrying softly across the starlit grass. "I don't feel like I have to chase anything. I can just walk, just exist. And it's enough." The dream heard him, and the stars above pulsed gently in reply. The meadow began to fade, not suddenly, but like a painting gently being washed into another canvas. The shimmering grass dimmed, the starlit brook dissolved into mist, and the silver trees folded inward as though bowing goodbye. Doofenshmirtz did not feel alarmed. Instead, he felt a curious pull, a guiding hand of the dream nudging him toward something more intimate. When the haze cleared, he found himself standing before a small, cozy house. It was not the tall and foreboding building of his childhood in Drusselstein, where shadows crept long across the cracked floors and where bedtime was something cold and lonely. No, this was different. The house was warm, light spilling from its windows in a soft amber glow, and smoke curling gently from a chimney as though announcing that inside was safety. Doof stepped closer, his breath catching. The door opened with a creak, not ominous but welcoming, like the sigh of an old friend. Inside was a room bathed in golden lamplight. A crackling fireplace filled the space with a faint pop and hiss, and the air smelled faintly of cocoa, sweet and rich. There was a bed waiting for him, not a stiff cot, not a forgotten couch, but a real bed. Wide, soft, layered with blankets that looked impossibly fluffy. The kind that seemed to embrace you before you even touched them. At the foot of the bed, perched like a guardian plush toy, was Perry the Platypus, already settled, his fedora tipped forward just slightly as though he too was ready to rest. Doof's eyes softened. His throat caught with a sound that might have been a laugh, might have been something deeper. This is what it should have been like, huh?" he whispered, almost afraid to disturb the dream. He approached the bed and sat gingerly at the edge. The mattress dipped, welcoming him, holding him in a way no invention ever could. For a long moment he simply sat there, hands resting on his knees, letting the warmth of the room sink into his bones. Then slowly, as if giving in to something he had been denying his whole life, he lay back. The blanket rose up around him, tucking itself as though guided by invisible hands. The fire crackled softly. The golden light dimmed just enough to let the shadows gather in gentle corners. For the first time in decades, Heinz Doofenshmirtz felt like a child who belonged in a bedtime story. Not an afterthought, not a punchline, not the odd boy standing alone in the dark. Here he was simply someone allowed to rest. His eyes fluttered closed, and the dream deepened further. He found himself drifting into a smaller vision within the dream, a lullaby without words. The hum of the Sleep-inator from the real world seemed to filter through, soft and steady, wrapping around him like a melody. It wasn't the sharp, mechanical buzz of his inventions gone wrong. It had transformed into something soothing, like the low strings of a cello played by the night itself. He murmured half-formed words into the blanket, his lips moving as if he were talking to Perry again, or maybe to himself. Finally, warm. Finally, quiet. Perry in the dream gave a small, approving nod before curling up at the foot of the bed, his round form like a watchful anchor. The platypus didn't need to speak. His presence alone was the reassurance Doof had always needed. Outside the window of the dream house, the stars moved slowly across the sky, painting the world in slow arcs of silver light. They didn't hurry, didn't demand attention. They simply drifted, much like the inventor himself. Every heartbeat became slower, every breath deeper. The fireplace murmured softly, and the golden glow dimmed a little more, almost as if tucking the entire world to sleep along with him. Doofenshmirtz, half asleep within a dream, smiled faintly. It wasn't a schemer's grin or the nervous twitch of someone waiting for failure. It was the small, simple smile of a man who, for just one night, was safe. The dream grew quieter still, as though the universe itself was tucking Heinz Doofenshmirtz beneath its starry blanket. The warmth of the fire softened into a golden glow, flickering low but steady, while the air around the bed settled into a hush so profound it felt almost sacred. The entire room had transformed into a cradle of calm, a space built not for scheming or striving, but for rest. Doofenshmirtz sank deeper into the mattress, the blankets drawing around his shoulders as if guided by invisible hands. He let go, truly let go, of the day, of the years, of the endless cycle of plans and failures. The weight he had carried all his life, resentments, insecurities, lonely childhood memories, dissolved into nothingness, leaving only the simple, precious act of breathing. At the foot of the bed, Perry the Platypus remained, curled into a perfect, watchful sphere. His presence was not commanding, not intrusive. It was steady like a lighthouse beam on a calm sea. For Doof, that was enough. He didn't need Perry to speak or act. Just knowing that someone was there, even in a dream, made the silence warm instead of hollow. "Danke," Doof whispered softly into the dim light, his voice so faint it barely seemed to belong to the waking world. The word was not for his inventions, not for his lair, not even for himself. It was for Perry, for the dream, for the quiet gift of peace. The dream responded in kind. Outside the window, the stars shimmered into soft shapes, not cruel parodies of his past, but gentle reminders that even his strangest moments belonged somewhere. A crooked puppet, a birthday balloon, the outline of his tower, they glowed not as failures, but as pieces of a story uniquely his, and at last he could see them without bitterness. The fire dimmed further, settling into embers. Shadows wrapped the room in comfort, folding gently over him like the hand of night itself. Doofenshmirtz exhaled one final long sigh, the kind that comes when every last thread of tension finally unravels. His lips curved into the smallest, most genuine smile, a smile that had nothing to prove. And then, at last, he drifted away. No plotting, no worrying. Only sleep. Heinz Doofenshmirtz, once the lonely boy left standing outside in the cold, now lay safe, warm, and untroubled, dreaming in peace beside the quiet companionship of Perry the Platypus. And so the night closes gently around Doofenshmirtz. His inventions are quiet, his mind is calm, and his heart, so often hidden behind schemes and silliness, finds a moment of stillness it has always deserved. Here in the soft glow of his dream he rests. As you drift alongside him, may your own worries fade. May your thoughts grow softer, and may sleep find you with the same peace that found him tonight. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be gentle, your rest be deep, and may you wake with warmth in your heart. Until next time, from Sleepy Corner, sweet dreams.